The first thing I remembered was waking up to silence. Not the kind of peaceful quiet you'd expect in a hospital, but the hollow emptiness that comes when you realize no one is coming through that door. My name is Cordelia Blackwood, and 3 weeks ago, I had what the doctors called a minor cardiac event. Minor. That's what they labeled the moment my heart decided to skip beats like a broken record, sending me crashing to my kitchen floor while preparing Christmas dinner for a family that wouldn't show up anyway. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe, and please tell me and others, what's one life lesson everyone should hear before it's too late? Share it in the comments below. Thanks. The paramedics found me clutching a wooden spoon, my famous cranberry sauce splattered across the tile like abstract art. When I woke up in the cardiac unit, tubes snaking from my arms and a monitor beeping its mechanical lullaby, the first person I saw wasn't my daughter Serafina or my son Lysander. It was Nurse Patricia, a woman with tired eyes and gentle hands who would become more family to me in 5 days than my own children had been in 5 years. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said softly, adjusting my pillow. "You gave us quite a scare. Would you like me to call anyone?" I tried to speak, but my throat felt like sandpaper. When I finally managed a whisper, I asked for my children. Patricia's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something I couldn't quite read. "Let me check your emergency contacts," she said, but something in her voice told me she already knew what she'd find. It wasn't until the next morning, when my breakfast tray arrived with a folded piece of hotel stationery tucked beneath the orange juice, that I understood. The handwriting was Serafina's, all loops and flourishes like she was signing autographs instead of abandoning her mother. "Mom, we know you'll understand. We've had this cruise booked for months, and the doctors said you're stable. We'll call when we get back. Get well soon. S&L." 14 days. They left me alone for 14 days while they sailed around the Caribbean, posting sunset photos on social media with captions about much-needed family time. Family time that apparently didn't include me. I lay in that hospital bed, watching other patients receive visitors bearing flowers and homemade cookies, while my bedside table remained as barren as my hope. The other families would glance at me with pity, this woman who seemed to have no one. And maybe they were right. Patricia became my anchor. She'd linger after her rounds, sharing stories about her own children and grandchildren. She brought me books from the hospital library and occasionally smuggled in decent coffee from the cafeteria downstairs. During her night shifts, she'd sit with me when sleep wouldn't come, usually around 3 in the morning when the darkness felt too heavy to bear alone. "Tell me about them," she said one night, nodding toward the empty chairs beside my bed. So I did. I told her about Serafina, my beautiful, ambitious daughter who'd become a corporate lawyer in Atlanta. How she'd married Bartholomew, a hedge fund manager who spoke in numbers and treated family gatherings like networking events. I told her about Lysander, my sensitive son who'd found success as an art dealer in New York, living with his partner Kai in a loft that cost more than most people's houses. "They're good kids," I said, though the words felt like ash in my mouth. "Just busy." Patricia nodded, but her silence spoke volumes. By day 10, I'd overheard enough conversations to piece together the truth. The nurses thought I couldn't hear them discussing the situation at the station just outside my room. Words like abandoned and shameful floated through the air like accusations. They weren't wrong. But it was Patricia who gave me the push I needed. On day 12, as she helped me with my discharge paperwork, she squeezed my hand and said, "Cordelia, sometimes the family we choose is worth more than the family we're born into. Remember that." I was released on a Tuesday afternoon. No one came to pick me up, so I took a taxi home to my empty house in Magnolia Heights, the same house where I'd raised 2 children who couldn't be bothered to check if their mother was still breathing. Walking through my front door felt like entering a mausoleum. Everything was exactly as I'd left it on that fateful evening, the ingredients for Christmas dinner still scattered across the counter, now spoiled and attracting flies. The dining room table was set for 12, complete with my grandmother's china and sterling silver candlesticks. 12 place settings for a dinner that never happened, for grandchildren who never came, for a family that existed only in my memory. I stood in that dining room for what felt like hours, staring at those empty chairs. Each one represented a promise broken, a relationship neglected, a love taken for granted. The chair at the head of the table, where my late husband Reginald used to sit, seemed to mock me with its vacancy. He'd been gone for 3 years now, and sometimes I wondered if my children had died with him, leaving behind only these polite strangers who called me Mom, but treated me like an obligation. That's when I saw it, a stack of mail on the kitchen counter that my neighbor must have brought in. Bills, mostly, but there was something else. A manila envelope with my lawyer's return address. Inside, I found documents I didn't remember signing, papers that gave Serafina and Lysander power of attorney over my affairs, in case of medical emergency. My hands trembled as I read through the legal jargon. Apparently, while I was unconscious in the emergency room, they had these documents drawn up and rushed to the hospital for my signature. I vaguely remembered a lawyer appearing bedside, explaining something about protecting my interests, but I'd been so disoriented and grateful that my children had finally shown up that I'd signed without reading. The phone rang, interrupting my discovery. Serafina's voice was bright and artificial, like she was reading from a script. Mom. We're back. How are you feeling? The cruise was absolutely divine, you would have loved it. We brought you some souvenirs. I listened to her chatter about excursions and exotic foods while staring at the legal documents in my lap. When she finally paused for breath, I asked quietly, "When can I see you?" "Oh, well, we're exhausted from traveling, and Bartholomew has this important meeting tomorrow. How about next weekend? We'll take you to brunch." Next weekend. After abandoning me for 2 weeks, she wanted to pencil me in for next weekend. "That's fine, Serafina," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Take your time." After hanging up, I called my lawyer, Harrison Pemberton, who'd handled my family's affairs for 20 years. When I explained the situation, his long silence told me everything I needed to know. "Cordelia," he said finally, "I'm afraid those documents are legally binding. However, they were obtained under questionable circumstances. If you'd like to contest them." "What would that accomplish?" I asked. "It would give you back control of your life." Control. When was the last time I had that? For decades, I'd structured my entire existence around my children's needs, their schedules, their convenience. I'd canceled trips when they needed babysitting, liquidated investments to help with their business ventures, and turned down social invitations because I might miss their calls. But here's what I realized as I sat in my empty house, surrounded by the detritus of a Christmas that never came: they didn't want a mother. They wanted a safety net. Someone to handle the messy, inconvenient parts of life while they lived their Pinterest-perfect existences. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I made coffee, real coffee, not the hospital's watery substitute, and sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and pen. If my children wanted to treat me like a business transaction, then I'd handle this like one. First, I called Harrison and instructed him to revoke the power of attorney documents. Then I contacted my financial advisor and moved my assets into accounts they couldn't access. I wasn't trying to punish them, I was simply reclaiming my autonomy. Next, I did something I hadn't done in 15 years. I called my college roommate, Evangeline Morrison, who lived in Asheville, North Carolina. We'd lost touch when I became consumed with motherhood and she'd pursued her career as a botanical illustrator. When she answered, her voice was exactly as I remembered: warm, genuine, alive. "Cordelia. My God, it's been forever. How are you?" For the first time in weeks, I told someone the complete truth. About the heart attack, the abandonment, the legal documents, the loneliness that had become my constant companion. Evangeline listened without judgment, without trying to fix me, without making excuses for people who didn't deserve them. "Come visit," she said simply. "Stay as long as you want. I have plenty of room, and the mountains are beautiful this time of year." That afternoon, I began packing. Not everything, I wasn't running away, but enough for an extended stay. As I folded clothes and selected books, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. The excitement of possibility, of choosing my own path instead of waiting for others to determine my worth. I left a note for Serafina and Lysander on the kitchen counter, right next to the unused Christmas dishes. "Gone to visit an old friend. Will call when I'm ready. Sometimes we need to lose ourselves to find out who we really are. Love, Mom." The drive to Asheville took 6 hours, but with each mile, I felt weight lifting from my shoulders. When I pulled into Evangeline's driveway, she was waiting on the porch with 2 glasses of wine and a smile that hadn't changed since college. "Welcome home," she said, and for the first time in years, that word actually meant something. Evangeline's house was a sanctuary, filled with her botanical artwork, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and the kind of comfortable disorder that comes from actually living in a space rather than maintaining it for show. Her garden was spectacular, even in winter, with carefully planned successive plantings that ensured year-round beauty. "I never married," she told me that first evening as we sat by her fireplace. "Never had children. For years, I thought something was wrong with me, watching friends like you build families while I just painted flowers. And now?" I asked. "Now I realize I was building something too. Just differently." Over the following weeks, I rediscovered parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. I helped Evangeline with her latest botanical project, documenting rare native plants for a conservation organization. We took long walks through mountain trails, discussing everything from literature to politics to the meaning of life. I cooked elaborate meals not because anyone expected them, but because I enjoyed the creative process. Most importantly, I began painting again. In college, I'd been an art minor, but marriage and motherhood had pushed those interests aside. Evangeline set up an easel for me in her sunroom, and I found myself losing hours to the meditative rhythm of brush on canvas. My children called, of course. First confused, then concerned, then increasingly frantic as they realized I wasn't simply taking a brief vacation. Their messages evolved from casual check-ins to demands that I return home immediately. "Mom, this is ridiculous," Lysander said in one voicemail. "You're acting like a teenager. We're worried about you." Worried. The word would have been funny if it weren't so painfully ironic. I didn't return their calls immediately. Instead, I let them sit with their concern, let them experience what it felt like to wonder about someone you loved. Maybe it would teach them something. Maybe it wouldn't. But for the first time in my adult life, their emotional education wasn't my responsibility. After a month in Asheville, I called them back. The conversation was tense, filled with accusations and hurt feelings. Serafina accused me of being manipulative. Lysander suggested I was having some kind of breakdown. "Perhaps I am," I said calmly. "Perhaps I'm breaking down the person I became to please you, and rebuilding the person I actually am." They didn't understand, and maybe they never would. But understanding wasn't my job anymore. I returned home after 6 weeks, but not to resume my old life. Instead, I put the house on the market. It was too big, too filled with memories of people who'd outgrown me, too expensive to maintain on my fixed income. With Harrison's help, I found a charming cottage near the Arts District downtown, walking distance from galleries, theaters, and the kind of life I'd always wanted but never pursued. Serafina and Lysander were horrified. "You can't sell the family home." Serafina protested during a tense dinner at an upscale restaurant where she clearly hoped the public setting would prevent a scene. "Why not?" I asked. "What family? You visit twice a year out of obligation. Lysander hasn't been home for Christmas in 3 years. What exactly are we preserving? The silence that followed was deafening. Bartholomew, Seraphina's husband, finally spoke up. Mrs. Blackwood, we understand you're upset about the vacation timing. This isn't about a vacation, I interrupted. This is about 30 years of prioritizing your needs over my own existence. This is about being treated like a convenience rather than a person. I set down my napkin and stood to leave. I love you both. I always will. But I won't sacrifice my remaining years waiting for you to remember I'm alive. As I walked away, I heard Seraphina calling after me, her voice cracking with something that might have been genuine emotion. I paused, turned back, and saw her crying, not the calculated tears of manipulation, but the messy, desperate sobs of someone realizing what they'd lost. For a moment, my maternal instincts kicked in. I wanted to return to the table, comfort her, make it all better. But then I remembered lying alone in that hospital bed, and I kept walking. The cottage I bought was perfect, small enough to manage independently, large enough for my art studio, and surrounded by a garden that needed the kind of attention I'd always given to other people. I joined the local gardening club, took pottery classes at the community center, and volunteered at the literacy program downtown. Slowly, I built a new life. Not a replacement for the family I'd lost, but something entirely different. Something that belonged to me. Evangeline visited frequently, sometimes staying for weeks at a time. We'd become the family we'd chosen, supporting each other's dreams instead of sacrificing them for others' expectations. Other friends followed, people I met through volunteer work, art classes, and neighborhood gatherings. My cottage became a gathering place for kindred spirits, people who understood that it's never too late to reinvent yourself. My children kept calling, less frequently as time passed. The conversations were stilted, careful, full of unspoken resentments on both sides. They visited occasionally, awkward encounters where we all pretended things were normal while navigating around the elephant in the room. But something had shifted. They no longer took my availability for granted. When they needed something, advice, emotional support, or just someone to listen, they asked rather than demanded. They scheduled visits in advance and actually showed up when they said they would. It wasn't the relationship I'd once dreamed of, but it was honest. And perhaps that was more valuable than the illusion of closeness we'd maintained for so many years. One afternoon, nearly a year after my hospitalization, Seraphina appeared at my cottage unannounced. She looked tired, older somehow, as if the past year had aged her more than the previous decade. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. We sat in my garden, drinking tea from mismatched cups I'd bought at a local pottery sale. She admired my flowers, commented on the cottage's charm, made small talk about everything except why she'd come. Finally, she said, "I've been thinking about what you said. About being treated like a convenience." I waited, not making it easier for her. "You were right," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as a person with your own life, your own dreams. You were just Mom. Always there, always willing to drop everything for us. It never occurred to me that you might need the same consideration." She paused, struggling with words that had clearly been rehearsed but felt difficult to say. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "Not just for the cruise. For all of it. For taking you for granted, for treating your love like it was unlimited and free. For forgetting that you're not just my mother, you're Cordelia, a woman who deserves better than we gave you." I felt tears threatening, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of a wound finally being acknowledged. "Thank you," I said simply. We talked for hours that afternoon, really talked, perhaps for the first time in decades. She told me about her marriage troubles, how Bartholomew's demanding career was putting strain on their relationship. She confessed that she'd been considering divorce but was afraid of being alone, afraid of disappointing everyone, afraid of admitting failure. I shared my own journey of self-discovery, the joy I'd found in simple pleasures, the peace that came from living authentically rather than performing for others. As the sun set, painting my garden in golden light, Serafina said, "I want to learn how to be better. Not just as a daughter, but as a person. Will you teach me?" It was the beginning. Not a return to our old relationship, but the possibility of building something new, something based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. Lysander followed a few months later, his visit equally awkward and equally necessary. The conversations were similar: acknowledgement, apology, a tentative reaching towards something healthier. I didn't forgive them immediately or completely. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't a switch you flip but a process you navigate. Some days, I felt generous and understanding. Other days, the old hurt would surface, and I'd remember the loneliness of that hospital bed, the silence of unanswered calls, the years of feeling invisible in my own family. But gradually, we found our way to a new normal. My children learned to show up, not just physically, but emotionally. They called regularly, not out of guilt but out of genuine interest in my life. They visited my cottage and admired my paintings, met my friends and seemed genuinely happy that I'd found community and purpose. Most importantly, they stopped seeing me as an extension of themselves and began recognizing me as an individual with my own wants, needs, and boundaries. The moral of this story isn't about dramatic gestures or perfect reconciliations. It's about the quiet courage required to reclaim your own life when others have forgotten you're living it. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is teaching people how to love you properly. Sometimes, it means walking away from relationships that diminish you and walking toward ones that celebrate who you are. Sometimes, it means choosing yourself when everyone else has chosen to forget you. I learned that family isn't just about blood or obligation. It's about showing up, paying attention, and treating each other like the complex, deserving human beings we are. I learned that it's never too late to start over, to plant new gardens, to paint new pictures, to write new chapters in your own story. Most importantly, I learned that you can't save relationships by sacrificing yourself. Real love requires two people who see each other clearly and choose to stay anyway, not out of duty or habit, but out of genuine appreciation for who the other person is. My heart attack didn't just restart my cardiac rhythm, it restarted my entire life. And while I wouldn't wish that experience on anyone, I'm grateful for the wake-up call it provided. Because sometimes, you have to nearly lose everything to realize you've been living for everyone except yourself. The woman who went into that hospital was someone who existed primarily for others. The woman who came out decided she was worth existing for too. And that, perhaps, made all the difference.